Hello, my name is Dr. Jeannie Bailey. On behalf of CME Outfitters, I would like to welcome and thank you for joining the episode 1 of a 3-part CMEO cast series entitled Best Practices for OUD, Optimizing Long-Term Outcomes for Patients with OUD. And by the way, OUD is a commonly used abbreviation for opioid use disorder. Today's episode is entitled In It for the Long Game, Examining the Role of Extended Release Medications for Addiction Treatment in the Relapse Prevention of OUD. This activity is brought to you by CME Outfitters, an award-winning and accredited provider of continuing education for clinicians across the globe. I'm Dr. Jeannie Bailey. I am an associate professor of psychiatry at Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island. And I'm also the Director of Research and the Director of Medications for Addiction Treatment at the Stanley Street Treatment and Resources, Inc. in Fall River, Massachusetts. The learning objective for today's program is to analyze the latest clinical updates on the safety and efficacy of extended release medications for opioid use disorder to help prevent relapse. First, let's take a look at opioid use disorder. It is drastically underdiagnosed and undertreated. As you can see in this slide, many people, at least 82% on the Medicaid rosters, are using high-dose opioids without having a diagnosis. Once we actually get the diagnosis, only 25% of the publicly funded treatment programs provide any medications, and if you're lucky enough to have insurance, you will only get medications in 50% of those programs. If you look at the overdose-related deaths, we have at least 20 to 30 additional people who have overdosed without having a fatality. If we were able to provide treatment to only 1% of those with opioid use disorder, we could save as many as 200 overdose deaths a year. What are some of the reasons why people are not receiving treatment? Well, frankly, some of that has to do with clinicians' attitudes. When surveyed, we find that emergency room physicians, 1 out of 10, say that treating these patients are at least satisfying. Many of them thought that the disease was untreatable. As much as 50% actually thought it was an untreatable disease. People do not want these individuals in their waiting room. They felt like they were using resources that they could provide to better patients or different patients. When we looked at emergency rooms, OB doctors, pediatric professionals as well, we found that only a third felt like they were really prepared. When you look at data around who's receiving medication and compare the services that were rendered in 2006 to the services rendered as recently as 2015, you can see that the situations have really, and the location has really changed most. What used to be done in inpatient is now occurring more often in outpatient and intensive outpatient settings. And the medications used, primarily buprenorphine, were available at the same rate pretty much as they are now. We can see that very few people receive naltrexone, and that in fact, in some settings, the amount of buprenorphine prescribed has gone down. What is the rationale and why should we be using medications for opioid use disorder? Well, we have lots of good data to support that if people are engaged in treatment, they're more likely to be alive. Treatment saves lives. We also have good data to suggest that if you're on medication, you have a greater possibility of positive outcomes compared to those that are just given an abstinence-based treatment alone. And if you are going into a detoxification program, leaving without medication and told to just seek psychosocial supports, you can see that the relapse rate is greater than 90% in those settings. We have a higher treatment retention if people are on medication, and you remain in treatment longer and without relapse if you are on medication without being tapered. This is some data that was generated in Massachusetts, which is quite interesting, looking at those people who had had an overdose and what happened to them in the following 12 months. A startling low number of individuals receive any medication. And if you receive no medication, you can see by the green line that's labeled none, that you have a much greater probability of being dead than if you are on a medication, even methadone or buprenorphine. And there was only like 6% of the people in the sample on naltrexone. So it was felt that it was a poor indicator of the ability of naltrexone to prevent death. However, the numbers do speak for themselves. We have several medications that the FDA has approved for the treatment of OUD, and they include methadone, buprenorphine, and buprenorphine with naloxone, which is a deterrent added to it, and naloxone alone. As you can see from this slide, these are interacting with the mu receptor in different ways. Methadone is a full mu agonist. It's available in a liquid solution, sometimes in little tablets or discs. But the big issue is that if you're treating opioid use disorder with methadone, you have to go to a clinic, which is an OTC, highly regulated environment every day. Once you obtain a certain status and have demonstrated that the medication is working for you, people are allowed to have take-homes, but largely it's seen as a daily dosing schedule. Buprenorphine is a partial mu agonist, and it comes in pills as well as implants and injectables. We noticed that depending on the formulation, it can range from a daily dosing right up to weekly injections, monthly injections, or a 6-month implant. If you're looking for the combination formulation, it is available in tablets and films and has to be taken daily. And naltrexone is a mu antagonist, which means it's interacting differently with the receptor. And it is available not only in tablet form, but more often for OUD in an extended release injection that occurs every 4 weeks. What are some of the information that we have about the efficacies of these different medications? We have some good data that methadone and buprenorphine are pretty equally effective. There's actually some suggestion that people actually are maintained longer and better on methadone. We're wondering if that had to do with the dosing of the buprenorphine in those studies, but be it as it may, it is sort of at this point felt to be equally effective. There's some new studies suggesting the efficacy of extended release naltrexone being equal to buprenorphine. And if you look at sort of the downsides or adverse reactions, you certainly have more problems when you have a full agonist on board, because you can have respiratory depression and overdose issues. When you've got an agonist on board, you are exposing the neonatal environment to the presence of the opioids as well. And there seems to be more cognitive and psychomotor dysfunction when you're on an agonist. And of note, naltrexone doesn't have any of these. There seems to be a lot more diversion or non-medical use of the agonist or partial agonist as well. There's some data that tried to look at the first long-term medication that was available to us, which was the implantable buprenorphine known as Probufene. And this slide sort of gives you a summary of the data from the study that was conducted in multiple sites, paid for by the pharmaceutical company in order for them to get approval for the medication to be released. And what you see here is the cumulative number of people who remained completely opioid free over the 6 months of treatment. This was a population of people who were stable, had to be on 8 milligrams or less, and they were randomized into a double dummy trial in which everyone received a pill and everyone received an implant. And the groups were placebo versus active drug. The goal of this study was to demonstrate that the implant was non-inferior to the standard of practice, which was sublingual. And as you can see from this graph on the right side of the slide, it clearly, the survival curve demonstrates that as far as people who were able to remain abstinent, the implant was non-inferior to the standard of care. The next extended release preparation that we had available to us is a buprenorphine injectable that goes under the trade name of Sublocade. Here it's known as buprenorphine RX. And what this slide does is tells us the data from their long-term recovery study. Everyone went through a treatment course of a randomized trial in which they were exposed to the injectable versus placebo. And those people that made it through that trial and had received even one injection were invited to enroll in what was known as the recovery or remission from chronic opioid use study. This data is new data for us, and it shows that the longer you stayed on the injectable, the greater probability or the greater chance you had to be totally abstinent at 12 months. You can see that the people who received 1 to 2 shots in the gray area compared to those that stayed in the study and received 12 injections had an increasing probability of being totally abstinent at 12 months. Of note, only about 20% of the people left the study and went on to take any additional pharmacology. So this is largely looking at the medication treatment they received while in the study. This other side just reinforces this yet again, showing that the number of shots you received was directly correlated with your ability to be opioid-free at 12 months. There's an additional injectable that is, we hope, to be soon available to us. It has tentative approval by the FDA, and it's currently known as CAM 2038. This is data from the long-term safety study, which looked at people who were already on buprenorphine transferring onto the injectable, and those are your dotted, those are your solid lines up at the top, as well as individuals who came onto the program de novo, who had never were using illicit opiates and went directly onto the CAM product. These people were followed for 12 months. There was flexible dosing. People had weekly or monthly doses depending on the clinical situation and depending on the decision of the clinician. And you can see that people remained opioid-free that came in as opioid-free, and those that were de novo gradually improved in their illicit opioid use. On the right side of the slide, you can also see that their CAL score, which is really just a measure of opioid withdrawal, was low at the beginning and remained low throughout the study. The data here is looking at what we know from a study that Dr. Nunez and his colleagues did, which sort of demonstrated the notion that treatment as usual was not nearly as effective as the other long-term extended release product we have, which is extended release naltrexone, marketed under the name of Vivitrol. When you looked at people, and all of these individuals had had some kind of involvement with the penal system, jail, but they came out of short-term inpatient, long-term inpatient, or outpatient settings, and you looked at how well they did with just the treatment as usual as rendered in these settings versus receiving extended release naltrexone injections, you can see that the likelihood of relapse was much greater in those that received the TAU. Even out at 6 months, the use of extended release naltrexone for 6 months also tended to have better outcomes and tended to protect people from relapse onto opioid use. The extended release naltrexone, though, has had some concern. People have had concerns about it because we didn't have good efficacy data. And over the last year, there have been 2 trials that have been published, last year or so now, I guess. One of them came from Norway, in which they looked at 159 people and randomized them to receive either extended release naltrexone injections for 3 months or daily buprenorphine dosing, and that dosing was flexible anywhere from 4 to 24 for, again, 12 weeks. And when they looked at those groups, we found that there was really no significant difference in their ability to stay away from illicit opioids, their ability to be retained in the study, and it was felt that the individuals had fewer cravings if they were on the extended release naltrexone and had more satisfaction. I'd like to caution you about the last thing, however, because you were comparing people who were having to come to the clinic once a month for injection versus people who had to attend daily in order to get their buprenorphine in Norway. The other study that gave us some data about the comparative efficacy was a study known as XBOT, which was published in Lancet in 2018, which was a study that was funded by NIDA, multi-site clinical trial through the network that's known as the CTN. And we randomized individuals while in detox to either receive sublingual buprenorphine or extended release naltrexone. And this slide demonstrates the 2 survival curves that you'll see if you look at the primary source. What this demonstrates is that, in fact, and the next slide shows it in a different way, that the difficulties were that when you were randomized to receive buprenorphine, it was pretty easy for you to get onto the medication and not have the hurdle of induction. And therefore, the people that were randomized to buprenorphine did better when you look at relapse rates over the 24 weeks. There were fewer relapses in the buprenorphine group than in those that were randomized to naltrexone. However, if you take the population and look at the per protocol sample, which is the group of people who received the medication at all and were able to be inducted, that difference really disappears and the efficacy of the two drugs look pretty much the same. That's the difference that you see on the survival curves here, in which as time went by, the relapse rates were very similar for the individuals who were able to get inducted onto the medication. So what are our goals, and what do we hope that you will be the take-home messages from today? We want you to consider the clinical benefits of medications for opioid use disorder, especially the extended release formulations, and we want you to incorporate these into your treatment programs. And thank you for joining us today for episode 1 of our 3-part CMEO cast series. To view additional episodes on helping your patients overcome the detox hurdle, as well as best practices for applying these extended release formulations in real-world settings, please visit our website at www.cmeoutfitters.com. You can also visit www.cmeoutfitters.com to access any of our opioid educational hubs, which is a premier source for education and resources. Thank you very much, and we hope that these tools and tips will be useful to you and your patients.